Ab wheel rollouts versus stretch outs on gymnastics rings. Which ones are better for you? What are the pros and cons of using each tool for one of the greatest core and abdominal exercises ever? The first thing to do, though, is to understand why this exercise is so effective and why it works so well. Because ultimately, your abs have almost nothing to do with this type of a motion. So why does it work? Well, it's not really about what you do with your arms, but what you do with your pelvis. Of course, your abdominals work with your glutes in a synergistic fashion to create a posterior pelvic tilt. And then as you stretch out, there's more and more resistance against that tilt until eventually maybe you lose it a little bit, and that's when you feel it in your lower back. So when we stretch out, it's actually working the abs isometrically as we're increasing resistance dynamically. So the pros and cons of using each tool just boils down to what is easier for you to maintain that isometric contraction in your abs while adjusting the dynamic resistance. One of the advantages to using an ab wheel is to use a predetermined stopping point. Sometimes I'll just even put my foot in front of a client when they're training so the wheel hits my foot, because if we have this tendency to be good until a certain point and then we lose it, well, that's just kind of playing chicken with how far you can go over a cliff. So instead, having a very definitive stopping point gives us the ability to keep that pelvic tilt, work on abdominal tension, shoulder control, tension in the lats, while ensuring we don't go too far. Then, if you want to make it harder, you just back up about an inch to increase the resistance. And you typically don't have such a stopping point when it comes to using rings, where you just can keep going and going until you feel it in your lower back, especially if you're going with so much volume that your abs just get tired and you lose that ability to hold that pelvic tilt. However, the advantage with using rings is you have that pendulum effect. So if I start further forward, the rings are kind of giving me an assistance coming back. And that gives me the ability to regulate the resistance depending on how far I go. And then if I want to make it harder, I just simply back up, and that gives me more control over the resistance. You typically don't have quite as much minute resistance control with an ab wheel. You're either doing it on your knees or on your toes, which can be a very big jump in the increase in the resistance. So you're basically stuck with just how far out you can go, which is a good thing to adjust, but it just gives you fewer options to adjust the resistance on the fly. And then you have equipment setup, environmental things to consider as well. An ab wheel is great. You can literally use it anywhere you have just a flat surface or a hardwood floor, and some people even get creative with doing these things on incline boards and 2x4s that they slant up to adjust the resistance that way. Rings and suspension straps and stuff, you've got to hang it from somewhere, which can limit the types of places where you may be able to do the exercises. Of course, it is worth mentioning the versatility of rings versus the ab wheel as well. With rings, you've got all sorts of different exercises you can use for practically every major muscle group in your entire body. Ab wheels are, well, they're basically ab wheels and not a whole lot more beyond that. So like many things in our fitness culture, a lot of it just boils down to personal preference and what do you personally like to use versus also what sort of resources do you have. If you have rings, don't worry about going out and spending money on an ab wheel if you're kind of feeling like, I'm not really sure about it. Same thing on the other way around. Me personally, I much prefer doing the stretch outs on the rings just because I find it so much easier to dial in that resistance and work my abs so much harder. Typically doing about 4 to 6 repetitions at a time, and I always keep it roughly in that rep range because personally I would much rather work my muscles harder rather than longer. But for you, it's always about which one do you feel gives you the best ability to maintain that posterior pelvic tilt and work your abs at a very high level of intensity. Love to hear your thoughts down below in the comments section. Check out more videos up here for more. Thanks much for watching. Be fit, live free.